Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today is a very exciting day here at Verified First because we are joined by Tim Toterhi, the CHRO at Science and Medicine Group and founder of Plotline, to discuss removing the glue, getting employees unstuck in their career development. This past year, we have spent our time having important conversations with some of America's most notable leaders in the HR and TA space. Through our HR at the Table Thought Leadership webinars, we discussed the role HR and TA have in DE&I, brand, technology, talent, culture, leadership, and so much more. Our goal is to bring relevant and timely topics to our HR and TA community that supports you in your roles. All of these topics can be accessed through our HR at the Table resources page on our website at verifiedfirst.com. With each webinar you watch, you can earn 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. You also have the option to receive credit for attending today's webinar too. If these discussions are important to you, be sure to check out our HR at the Table calendar to keep up to date on topics we're talking about. We've also worked hard to bring you a comprehensive deep dive of all the topics we've discussed through this series. So, if you'd like to gather more insight, be sure to check out our blog page, also at verifiedfirst.com. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to discuss some housekeeping items. As I mentioned, this webinar is available for 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. For our live attendees looking to receive credit, be sure to stick around for our post-webinar survey. If you're listening to this on demand, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. Don't worry, this webinar is being recorded, so you can use it as a resource, pass it along to your coworkers, or watch it whenever you want. We'd love for you to utilize the chat function during this event to send in any questions that you have for our speakers. To prepare, let's practice now. In the chat feature, let us know where you're tuning in from and if this is your first time attending HR at the Table. Hi, Anna from Boston. Good to have you. Kirsten from California. Andrew from Texas. Wow. They are rolling in. Jackie from Wisconsin. Hello. Awesome. It's wonderful to have you all here. Hi, Amanda from Florida. All right. With that in mind, I'd like to start by thanking Clear Company for sponsoring this episode of HR at the Table and by officially welcoming everyone to today's discussion. Please send a friendly hello and warm welcome in the chat to our HR at the Table host, Liv Carter and Tim Toterhi, the CHRO at Science and Medicine Group and founder of Plotline. Without further ado, take it away, Liv.
Thank you, Voice in the Wind, or Amanda, as we like to call her in-house. Hello and welcome to another episode of HR at the Table. I am Liv Carter. I am your host for today's HR at the Table interview. Now, I am quite excited to have the opportunity to sit down and chat with Tim Toterhi for a discussion on getting employees unstuck in their career development or removing the glue. Today, we'll be discussing some of the challenges with today's workforce, along with ways we can make work more meaningful by investing in employee growth and development. So today, Tim, so glad to have you here. You are CHRO at the Science and Medicine Group, founder of Plotline Leadership, TEDx speaker, author, a father, so much more. Such an honor to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm really happy to be here today.
Great. It's so great to have you. Tim, you know, I'm very excited to kick off our conversation around employee engagement and career development. But before we get started, I'd love for you to just share a bit about what you do. I listed off a lot of roles and hats that you wear already, but maybe a little bit what you do at the Science and Medicine Group, along with what you've started with Plotline Leadership.
Sure. I'm basically a career coach in CHRO. I specialize in talent and performance management primarily. I've worked with large organizations and small startups, so hopefully can lend a bit of perspective to both. I think we have a variety of listeners today, so hopefully that will be helpful. And I just love all of these topics. So I love to talk about them, to learn from our audience, and kind of just geek out on all this stuff. Is going to be great. Science and Medicine Group, just a word on that, is a market research and data intelligence organization that helps connect companies to the hardest to reach audiences in, you guessed it, science and medicine. So that's a little bit on them. If you want to know any more about that, I won't go into a big bio. You can just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with and learn from you guys. So more than happy to do that.
Great, great. Thanks for the introduction, Tim. And to our audience, we do have Tim's LinkedIn at the end of this event, so stay tuned for that to connect with him. Well, I say we get started, and I think it's important if we start, at creating meaningful work. Now, the Harvard Business Review stated in an article that there is only a marginal association between pay and job satisfaction, and that job satisfaction is predominantly based on engagement, which I think brings us to our conversation today about engagement, career development. So Tim, before we get into the career development side of the things, I'd like to discuss some of these findings. And I'm wondering, why do you think job satisfaction is so closely related to an employee's engagement in their work today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this just to separate for a second the view of satisfaction versus engagement. For a long time, compensation was considered this satisfier or a hygiene factor. The idea being that you had to pay people enough to kind of want to come to work. But you didn't get these bonus points if you overpaid, at least in the long term, because ultimately it normalized. So you'll see a lot of research that will indicate that compensation is basically a hygiene factor. It's kind of like the temperature in the room, right? I can be satisfied with what's going on here today, but if my AC goes out in a North Carolina summer, I'm instantly going to become dissatisfied. So I can be satisfied and I can be dissatisfied, but I really can't be uber satisfied. I can't be like tremendously okie dokie. It's like just this, there's a limit to that. And so that's why folks pivot typically to think about employee engagement. But, as I was thinking about the research, I had just an off the side thought around, things have gotten really weird over the last 18 to 24 months with hiring. And I think, our listeners, whether you're working at a one-person shop at a startup, or you're part of a huge organization, if you've been hiring people over the last couple of years, your compensation conversations have probably gotten pretty in-depth. And I think that's primarily for two reasons, right? First is that people are valuing their time differently than they've ever done before. So, you could still ask folks to put on a suit, come into the office, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of folks are saying, wait a minute, there's a premium to doing that. And that is buying the clothes, getting in the car, paying for the gas, having the bookends of the day different, right? So that's going on. And the other thing that's probably even more pronounced is the opportunity cost that people are starting to consider for the first time. So many of you guys, if you've been, at the HR game for a while, when I was going through my career, there was always somebody saying, well, hey, if you work a little bit harder, you spend another 10, 15, 20 hours a day, whatever it is, working, okay? Impossible, but you try that. Well, then maybe someday I can't promise it, but you might get this promotion. Well, that doesn't work anymore, because folks are going to sit there and go, wait a minute, why would I do that when I could use my Saturday morning side hustle to make cash now? And so I think the topic of the conversation thing has gotten very real. And so the reason I bring that up, Liv, is that I think that we've always thought about it as a hygiene factor. I don't know that it still is. It may be a little bit more than that. So I think it's really smart to kind of pivot that conversation to think about what are the things we can actually get our arms around right now. And for me, that is engagement, that is meaning, that's the critical important thing that needs to be discussed, because the others, everybody's trying to figure it out still.
Right. Yeah. I love that you distinguish the difference between job satisfaction and engagement, because I think historically we've kind of grouped them in the same bucket, but over the last 18 months, it's been a fun little roller coaster, right? That has kind of changed the environment. So I think that's a great call out. So Tim, taking, the definition of engagement that kind of you just preference us with, how does the meaning of work impact engagement and that buy-in from employees today?
So it's interesting. When I look at engagement, and I'll make this other distinction between engagement and meaning, right? I don't think that any of us in HR, myself, can give someone else meaning. I don't think that's possible. I think we can give direction, we can give guidance, we can give sort of a viewpoint of why and the work that they do is important, but meaning is intrinsic. You have to find that for yourself. And so that's a big distinction. What we can do, and I'm going to be really cheesy and everybody can collectively roll their eyes for a second, and then I'll come back to why I think this is important. But I think what a company needs to do really well is to focus on their vision, mission, values, behaviors, strategic map, right? Your priority map, and then tie that to goals. And I know as soon as I said vision, I might have lost some folks because they go, oh yeah, a lot of it, and that's well deserved because companies have done this wrong for so long that it's kind of lost the value of what it can bring to an organization. So if you think about creating meaning, the first step of meaning is knowing what we're supposed to be doing at an organization. And how do people typically go around this? They'll get a few people in the room, they'll do a couple of surveys, they'll put together a vision statement, and they'll put it on the wall like it's an art, and they'll be really proud of it. And they might even go and talk about it and have a program. But then what happens is something sort of magical. The art that they had on the wall that they were so proud of suddenly becomes wallpaper. Nobody even sees it anymore because it's not backed up by process and culture and behavior and all of those things. So I think the first step is to, when you're thinking about engagement, is how do you make that through line so that everything you do from the biggest picture of vision aligns to what people do every day in their daily jobs. And that's critical. That's sort of the meat on the bones, if you will.
Yeah, from wall art to wallpaper. That's very, I've never thought of it that way, but I've seen it happen like in organizations, and I'm sure our audience has experienced that too, whether it's their current organization or previous ones. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
No, I was going to say, because one of the funny tests about this is if people are in debates is I often say, well, if you took your vision statement and put it on your competitor's website, would anybody notice? And the answer is no. Well, then maybe we got to rethink some things. And that's hard with the bigger things. But when you get down into the weeds of your strategy, that's where HR really should be playing, is in that deep connection to what people do.
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to, call out if there are any eye rollers, like remember there's a chat function. You can ask Tim follow-up questions if you want him to expand a bit more. But yeah, I think that's a great call out. So Tim, from, this engagement, does that kind of facilitate, does engagement stemming, from the work that you provide meaning to work, does that facilitate employee development? Is that kind of like a starting place?
Absolutely, because I think if you can draw the line between what the organization does for the vision, the mission, the values, the behavior, what you're doing is you're outlining to people not only what they need to be doing, aligned to strategic priorities, but then how they do it from behaviors. So we think about competency models and how that aligns together. But I think really where you align it to development is you give people a roadmap that says you're coming to the table with attributes already. So you have to think about what are the things that you want to leverage that you already have as skill sets, and what are the things that you want to develop that are really not in your toolkit yet. And so it becomes very practical because you're not just, I'm going to go take a public speaking course because I think it's a good idea. It's no, I'm going to do this because it's in service of my role, which is in service of the company, which is in service of my next step. So the more that I can align my ambitions, my work with the company's need, then I can target my development. And so that kind of gives us a roadmap of, well, I'm engaged because there's some purpose to what I'm doing. It's not just activity for activity's sake.
Right. That alignment between personal, yep, okay. That, yeah, love that. So, I'm going to ask, this might be a loaded question, but, in previous HR at the tables, we've talked about, DE&I, and we've talked about employee engagement, we've talked about, recruitment, brand, etc. And it seems to always come back to, is it solely HR's job? Is this, a one man or one woman, one team show? Or who else should be involved in an organization? And how do you get buy-in there? Like, where do you start? And this might be a loaded question, so feel free to kind of.
It's a really good question. It's an important question, and I think every organization needs to make the decision around it, because what I would say is that employees don't work for HR, and that's your answer. They don't work for us. Who do they work for? They work for the managers. And so, your manager really has a responsibility to, nurture the employee, to grow the employee, to kind of move the employee through the ranks. But that only works if that's valued by the organization, right? So HR has expertise in things. But again, I go back to alignment. So I'll give you a real world example. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have been involved in building career maps and training programs. And they could build the most wonderful ladders and lattices and paths, and that's great work. It dies on the vine if your culture allows managers to hoard talent and say things like, well, that's my guy, you're not going anywhere. And if they're rewarded for that, all the great work you did was for naught. And so you have to think about what is the construct in which you work as an HR profession with your company. If you want to be able to develop talent, you have to have managers and leaders that support that and actually pay for that in a way, value it. But it's got to be set up in every aspect of what you do in order for it to work.
Right, absolutely. And we actually have a comment here from, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but Sanjukta. She mentions that our messaging has been, it's not just an HR role, it's everyone. She says, Sanju, okay, thank you. We have it as part of their goals form called the EIB commitment. So it looks like Sanju and the team over there is kind of getting that commitment, that buy-in across the company. So that's awesome to hear.
And that's a fantastic step, right? I think that's great. If you have an organization that is saying, look, we want to make development part of a goal and actually have it visible and people are getting recognized for doing it, that's a great step. There's ways to take that even further. You could think about how you align that with performance. My question out to folks is, when you think about the business rules for your organization, are development goals rated like performance goals are rated? Should they be? There's no right or wrong answer, but when you make that choice, well, then you're setting up your systems to align to that, your process to align to that, because ultimately the next question becomes, are you paying for it, right? So, again, this is where we get very practical with the work that we do on development. We could create, and a lot of companies do, huge competency models. They're very involved, and there's all different tiers. And if I asked an HR person to tell me what they were, chances are, in an honest moment, it'd be like, well, I don't know, it's too complicated, I can't figure it out. But even if you could, the question then becomes is, well, how much are they valued? How much are we paying folks for actually enabling those competencies which align to development? So there's a lot of cool stuff there, but it's got to align.
Yeah. Well, Sanju, there you go, some additional practical next steps there. So Tim, kind of going back to, meaning and work, and I love that you defined, the difference between engagement and meaning, and that kind of being an intrinsic thing of employees. How do we kind of guide or provide that structure for employees to kind of find meaning and work, whether it's HR's role or managers, leaders? What are some of the first steps that can kind of help there?
Yeah, so the structure, I think, around meaning, around development anyway, has to come from learning. So if you think about, just again, practically, you can use yourself as an example, right? Everybody who's listening, the question is, do you want to be the expert, or do you want to be on the path to expertise? So there's a subtle difference there, because if we get to be the expert, the question becomes, well, what's next? you see a lot of folks at the top and they're like, the whole lonely at the top thing. You're like, well, what do I do? What's next? How do I know? So by showing people, well, realistically, specifically for your role, where you are now, how do you get to the next place? What do you need to develop? What do you need to get rid of? That sets you on a path to learning, because I think that is really the journey. There's this notion that, sometimes people lose meaning over time, or they start to get fatigued through the process. I don't know if I buy that 100%, because there are things that people do over the course of a lifetime because it gives them meaning. I mean, everything from silly example, you can ask a bad golfer, they'll do it forever. and not that that's meaningful, but you think about realistically the work that we do, the volunteering work that we do, and all of us have, I bet, have different aspects of our job that give us meaning today. So I don't know about you, I don't get jazzed up about doing employee relations cases. I'm not super excited about doing another comp plan, right? But if I'm coaching someone about a leadership role and make that aha moment go off, and they take a different path because of it, super engaging, super that meaning to both parties. So I think you got to find it. You find that path, and then you put in steps in place to be able to take it through.
Yeah. So we were going to pivot and start talking about, developing career maps, but I want to take a second. So you mentioned, that the meaning really, I mean, honestly, it shouldn't go anywhere. Honestly, like you should always always provide the opportunities for employees to find meaning in their work and encourage that. I guess my question would be, where you find meaning might look different over time, or what meaning in your work looks like over time in your career. And so for employees, how do you start or like manage that over time? If you have an employee that's, their first year here, this is maybe what's next for them and what they're passionate about and what they care about. But then, 5 years from now, it could look very different.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really insightful to kind of think about that. There's an expression that a lot of coaches use, is that you coach who shows up, and who shows up will be different year to year and day to day. And so when somebody comes in, they're thinking about their career, and I think just to make it practical, where you see this in a most pronounced way is in talent reviews. So those folks who are doing talent reviews, whether you're using a classic 9-box or some other methodology, there's a view where you're trying to say, well, what does this individual want to do? What can they do from a performance and potential kind of frame? And what does the organization need to do? And you're trying to triangulate those three kind of factors. That's going to be different for folks throughout their career, right? There may be some aspects where, I'm a young HR VP, and my goal is I would love to get into compensation, and I would love to then build and become a compensation expert. That's my path. That's what I like to do. Well, that same HR VP could say, actually, I want to broaden my skill set within the HR VP ranks and actually maybe do something outside the US or outside Europe if you're there, broaden the skills there. Somebody might say, well, I'm an HR VP. I'd love to get into project management and do something different and manage. That's the thing, is the first part of it is having the conversation so that you understand that there's not a single path for something and be open to it. To me, that's really cool, where you get into some of the practical metrics of where we can expand people's careers. Because I think sometimes folks will make assumptions on what they see and not what they're hearing, not what's coming back at them. And once you start talking to people, you can say, well, number one, it's not about me, it's about you. And you might have something going on next year that's going to take you on a different path or take you out of it, and that's okay. So, to answer the question very specifically, I get really practical when I talk to folks about their careers and how it's going to show up, whether it's internally or externally through the organization. And I use the same model as we do when you hire people initially. We already have that tool. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Very, very insightful. I'm curious. Again, I'm just going to throw another follow-up question at you. Have you noticed any differences, in your experience with employees now being remote? Does that conversation or the ability to kind of manage that feel or seem different?
It does to a certain degree. I think, they're more aware of their choices. So in a good way, from their point of view, they're seeing, okay, wait a minute, everything's changed. I'm not landlocked to a particular geography, right? There's more opportunity open for me. There's more things that I can go, which actually puts pressure on HR people. We can't be vague. We can't sort of articulate things. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was working with an organization. We had a small office in Europe, and the person, it was in a QA role, phenomenal person, right? But it was still in that time period where everything was in office kind of deal. There wasn't the next step. That was a reality for that time. Some of those situations now, you might say, well, actually, that doesn't matter anymore. So you have to be, it puts a lot of pressure on us. We got to come back and say, well, here's what the plans are, guys. We got to be really thoughtful about, how you make it food. Because it's funny, I have this saying, if the only person talking to you about your career is a recruiter, it's time to listen. And I just think that puts a lot of pressure on HR folks to have those conversations, because if you won't have them, somebody else will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I was curious, and yeah, very insightful, Tim. Very insightful. So I think we were going to pivot a bit and start talking about, developing for career maps for internal growth. And, we've kind of already discussed it. Today's talent landscape is very difficult. It's tight, it's competitive. And we talked about that in our last HR at the Table as well. So organizations are looking internally, right? They're looking at their employees. We can't get the talent externally, looking at reskilling, cross-training, etc. I want to get your thoughts on that to begin with. Should we have always been looking internally first, or I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely, you should be looking internally, right? I mean, it's a known quantity, right? It's a known entity. When you're looking at somebody, there's a risk factor. But again, I think it comes back to how you set up your guiding principles or your business rules for how you operate within an organization. So something very simple, what does ready for a role mean, right? So when we think about that, there should be, or there could be, I wouldn't make a definitive statement, there could be a definition between who's ready for the next opportunity. Well, if it's an internal candidate, you might make the selection that you're going to take more risks, that you're going to say the person internally needs to be ready for the opportunity, not every aspect of the role. If somebody's coming from the outside, you might make the determination that they need to be ready for every aspect of the role after their onboarding, right? And that very practical distinction will shift things in favor of developing talent. But if your organizational culture is one that's saying, oh, there's no new good ideas internally, you got to go outside to get the best ideas, and then you're going to be shifted that way. So part of it is cultural, and then the second thing is practical. So when you look at like developing talent in an organization, every opportunity that you fill internally just practically creates another hole. So you have to think about it not one step at a time, but how the overall organization moves. And that could mean that you need to set up feeder pools early and have an early talent program that allows you to have that mobility of actually feeding folks through the system. So that's part of it. I think the other big part of it is how you motivate managers to actually take part in it, right? There has to be something. I'm going to use the terrible, tired expression of the war for talent, right? Or people say war on talent. I'm like, that's a little aggressive. But it's funny. So I've written a little bit about this, where I think we need to change the view of war for talent. It's not a war. You never win a war. You just lose less than the other guy. So instead of doing that, what you need to think about it is in terms of a space race. So if you think about the view of a space race, what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to create some gravity, right? So you have managerial gravity in a way. So you want the manager who has people lined up to work for him or her, right? That's the person that should be managing people, not the nightmare that you can't ever get somebody to work for, right? We've all experienced that. But more important than that, becomes the velocity factor. Do you reward people in your organization for helping folks lift off, for achieving flight, for driving their careers, all, whatever kind of symbolism you want to use. But I think if you have that in your mind where, let's reward people for helping folks grow, then you change the construct a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So Sanju actually commented as well and mentioned it's more of a mindset and a cultural commitment to that. Like you said, the velocity and gravity. Yeah. And I love that analogy. That's a great one. Like we might have to use that one more often. So kind of shifting gears a bit, I want to start with with your experience, how can we identify stuck employees, whether it's, they're disengaged, they're, complacent, maybe they're good where they are, they're not looking for future growth. What are some ways you've, identified those employees?
Yeah, it's funny I will say if you're doing it on an exit survey, it's too late, right? So you don't want to do that. I think the most of the audience would know all about employee engagement surveys and focus groups and the one-on-one interviews. I think really where you identify where folks are standing is through a feedback and coaching culture. So I say it that way because most managers, and I would dare say some HR people, are terrified of coaching, right? And not because it's scary and crazy, because there's a presumption that it's time consuming, right? If you think about, well, I got to have a coaching session with somebody. Oh no, I got to sit down. It's going to be an hour long. I'm going to sit across the desk. I don't have the time. It's terrible, right? Nobody wants that. Right? Well, really, if you want to make something interesting in your organization, forget about coaching for a second. Just focus on feedback. And feedback done well can be done in less than a minute, less than 60 seconds. And you can actually do marked, real improvement for folks over time in the moment. And if you want, I'll give you something outrageous. I'm a boxing fan, right? So love boxing. If you want to see the best coaching on the planet, watch boxing. Just watch a few rounds of it. Because what happens? This is what goes on. Got a guy or lady goes out and gets into a fight. Boom. Gets punched in the face a bunch of times. Punch in the face. This is not fun. This happens for 3 minutes, okay? Goes and sits on a stool, and one person gets in their face. And they have about a minute, but between all the fixing things up, about 30 seconds to say, I got an idea. How about you block, duck, and move back? Try that. Just block, duck, and move back. And they go, oh, that's a great idea. And so they go back out. Now it's round two. And guess what he's doing? Exactly what he was coached to do, what he got the feedback to do. He's block, duck, and moving. And everything goes okay. Goes back to round two, sits in his corner, says, well, okay, things are going great. I got another piece of feedback for you. Why don't you hit the other guy? Okay, and it sounds silly, but it's very, very practical advice. So if I break that down to sort of the business world of where this might make sense, imagine you're giving a presentation. And this actually happened to me years ago. Giving a presentation in front of an international audience, right? And it was a lot of different folks. Now, I'm originally from New York. You may be picking this up. I haven't got my Southern accent down just yet. But yeah, I was going through the presentation. After I got off the stage, a buddy of mine said, hey, I got to tell you something. I just want to give you a little feedback. He says, I liked your examples, really helpful, but I got to tell you, I think you'd identify with the audience a little bit better if you didn't sound like a ferret on Red Bull. You tend to talk a little fast when you get excited. It was very poignant, very practical, took 30 seconds. I remembered it 20 years later. I'm still working on the feedback. What are you gonna do? Right? But it's that I think if you can get into the habit, all seriousness, if you get into that habit within the organization, you'll see more movement practically for folks than if you put in giant programs, because it just becomes habit for folks. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I think, it's making me think Brene Brown talks about sliding doors and these little opportunities and kind of that same concept. It doesn't have to be, the Super Bowl of coaching and feedback, but start small there. So we do have a question here from Mira. They say, what suggestions do you have for small business actions to encourage personal development? especially for those that may not have a discrete HR function or supervisors who regularly collaborate with staff on developing career maps? Any
Yes.
thoughts?
It's harder and easier when you're at a small company. And I just give a little bit of encouragement, because if you're in the place of asking that question, you can model the behavior that you want to see. And so if you do something as simple as show people how to give this feedback, you can see that modeled really quickly and start to happen. The other thing that I would suggest is don't go too big. There's no need to have a program. Frankly, there may not be a budget for a program. So one thing that I suggest is to do, you probably all heard about it, but deliberate practice, right? Very focused, small, specific actions that can make difference over time. So when you're talking to somebody and you're thinking about how they should develop, pick one little thing and ask them to do that. And then go back and check and make sure that it's happening. And if they do, build on that success. So the boxing example that I mentioned sounded silly, but it's actually very practical. It's how you learn. So if I want to learn anything, well, I learn how to throw a jab, and then I learn how to throw a punch, and then I learn how to throw it with my other hand and back. So one thing over time, and that's what happens. And it goes back to the saying that people sometimes overestimate what they could do in a day, but drastically underestimate what they could do over a year's time. So if you pick these small things and model it, and probably the other thing I would say is actually you should be the recipient first. So ask your manager, your boss, to kind of give you some feedback first and take that on. Mm-hmm. That's a real easy, no cost, practical way of starting the process.
Right. Yeah. Mira, great question. And Tim, thank you for your response there. So kind of going back to our unstuck employees, what role does career mapping play in getting them unstuck?
Yeah, so career mapping is fantastic because it gives you literally a path of where to go. So if you have a series of roles that you can articulate for folks, let's be very practical. So I'm a project coordinator. I want to be a project manager. I want to then move to a senior project manager. The first thing that you need to do is ensure that your career map can actually pass the red face test, that there's enough difference between those roles where it's not just a title thing, I'm just giving them a title and give them a little bit more money and hopefully they'll stay. There has to be real meaning between what the different jobs are, because you don't want to create a problem for yourself where suddenly somebody comes back to you and says, well, I'm a project manager. How come I'm not a senior project manager? Uh-oh. There has to be a real view for that. So first step is building that in a way in partnership with the business that there's a tangible reason and value for it. And the second thing is ensuring you're pretty clear about what that value is and what you're going to pay for it. Because, hey, let's face it, if I'm going to go from a project manager to a senior project manager, there's going to be a cost for that. Well, what's the payoff? Is it the different types of projects, the number of projects, the complexity of projects? Am I doing something different? All of that has to be articulated. But I think a career map can be a wonderful way of getting that, assuming that you build it the right way.
Right. So I'm curious, Tim, in all your years of experience, have you, come across some do's, like, yes, absolutely do this, or some don't when it comes to, our audience kind of ranges in sizes, employee sizes, and resources even. So starting with building a career map for an employee.
Yeah, so I think it would apply to both, but I think specifically with a smaller organization, give yourself some elbow room. When you're looking at grading structures and you're looking at the ladders, you're looking at the career map, all of that has to be aligned. So if you think you're going to grow over time, do the right thing. Make sure that you have enough levels that you'll be able to not have to re-engineer everything just because you hired 12 more people, right? So you want to give yourself some room. I think the other thing, similarly for large organizations, is be thoughtful around the micro grades. So you may be in a situation where some cultures, and it's totally appropriate in some regions, where the what's next step up the ladder is critical. This happens in a variety of cultures where that is supremely important. And so if you're going to do it, you also have to think about the economics of what that is. So think about, I used project manager, senior project manager. Well, there might be project manager 1, 2, 3, senior manager. So think about your architecture is really important. At the same time, when you roll it out, don't over-engineer it. Build it as if you could show everybody exactly where they are, because they're going to want to know, and they're going to want to see what maps they are. So I think those are really important things to take into consideration when you're building these things.
Yeah, yeah, super, super helpful and really practical there advice. So Tim, obviously our audience is interested in career mapping and developing their employees, right? They registered for this event, they want to learn more. As we kind of discussed earlier, this is not just an HR task or project, right? It's something that's got to be kind of bled throughout the culture of the company. What would be your advice to kind of develop buy-in from leadership, or communicate the ROI of career mapping and whatnot?
Yeah, so it's interesting with the return on investment for talent maps become, you're hiring. And I think that's become even more pronounced over the last 24 months. So keeping folks within an organization versus having to do the rehire, the retrain. So, practically I would just build a business case, thinking about what is the cost for you bringing in somebody to the biggest role that you have. So if you hire a lot of X, think about what the cost is for doing that training, then moving it up, versus having to promote someone from within the ranks and doing that forward, and having more of a feeder pool for the organization. So part of that is just economics. And I think that's where you talk to different stakeholders. So you talk to your finance group, okay, there should be reason for that. You're going to talk to the general leadership. They need to know that, but they also need to understand why this is going to create the brand in the organization. So I'm going to go back to what we started with. Every company is going to have a brand, a talent brand, whether or not they think they have one, right? Because it's not written by you, it's written by your former, current, and future prospective employees, right? It's out there in the market. So you have to understand what it is and then be really honest. So sometimes HR will like to say, well, I think we should do this. This sounds like a good thing. Let's develop a career map. And that would make sense because it's good to promote people and move them through the ranks. But if your business model isn't that way, you're going to be spinning your wheels forever. There are some companies that say, hey, they do the math and they say we want folks to be here for 2 or 3 years, and if they leave, that's okay. We're going to hire more and they'll come in. You have to understand that reality before you start building it. So I would understand the economics and the business reality first, because you don't want to overpromise into the market and then have them come in and be incredibly disappointed. It's like going to a movie, right? You go to a movie, you're expecting to see a comedy, and you get to the theater and they show you a tragedy. Well, you're going to leave, you're going to walk out. So don't do that to yourself.
Right. That's not an ideal situation at all. That's awesome. So I do want to shift gears just because we're cruising along on time. So I want to go ahead and launch a poll, and as we're talking about career mapping and employee engagement, I want to ask our audience a bit about technology. Now, we know technology is not the end all be all, but it definitely can play a role in road mapping and whatnot. So this question is specific to our annual research, so it is going to be used in our annual guide. But Tim, with your experience, where do you see technology playing a role in road mapping employees, managing employee engagement? Are there tools or solutions that we don't have on this poll, that you think our audience should be aware of?
I think what has come up a lot lately is just various AI solutions that are trying to take the talent pool kind of from your applicant tracking system and thinking about, well, what might be next for them. So taking it a step further and looking at specifically around talent reviews. So they're in role X, where might they go? Trying to broaden and widen the pool. That's early stages. There are a couple of companies out there that are starting to do it, but it's tough to kind of jump on that and do that. I think, right now the HR space is just has so much technology in there. It can be a full-time job trying to sort through it all. So, if you're a smaller company, I would say, a good thing to do is to focus on the basics, make sure you have enough system rigor to help you scale and grow, and then focus on the talent review, the career pathing on a almost like, I'd say, but a manual basis, because you'll be closer to it and you can get your arms around it. As you grow, you'll need to scale through technology.
Yeah, yeah. So the results are pretty similar to what we're seeing kind of over these HR at the table. So HRS and ATS tend to be the highest kind of, I think they're developing more and more, and building your HR tech stack has become more and more important and a little bit more difficult, I will say, with all the offers out there. So Tim, just to kind of wrap up our webinar, we still have plenty of time, but I want to chat a bit about, building opportunities for growth. We talked about internal growth and road mapping and reskilling and all of that. But I want to get your thoughts on what sort of growth opportunities are you seeing employees looking for? Is it, a title change? Is it just, salary bonus? Like what are some of those opportunities that you're seeing?
It's funny. So the standards are always there. So title, compensation, all of that. Every organization also has what is important. So what's the currency? Some organizations, it's the number of people that you manage. Some is the budget that you have, the influence that you structure, whatever all that is. And I think that will always be important. But when it comes to growth opportunities, there's a couple of things that folks are looking for at different levels. So you think about project-based opportunities, the idea being that I have my core job and I'm doing that, but how do I differentiate myself? How do I get something else on that resume that I wouldn't otherwise get? So do I have that opportunity to be on that leadership project or that innovative system implementation or whatever it is? And then the second is, how do I learn more about my chosen profession? So can I get a rotational type program? And then, sometimes at the higher levels, there's also can I still do the international assignment? Is that available? But I think all of those, and we could talk about any of them, but all of those are in service of trying to personally differentiate you from every other person. So I've been picking on project managers for some reason this morning, but if I look at project managers, if I have 10 of them that are working, they may all have the same job role. They may all have the same descriptors on their resume. What I'm looking for is what is different about one than the other. What sets one apart? Well, I look at that when I hire them. I don't stop looking at that. I continuously look at that as they grow in an organization. So opportunities for growth, put it on the proverbial resume. What is the thing that you did that nobody else did differently? Now, when I go to think about promoting or next step up, it's a no-brainer. It's fact-based, right? So I think all of that is really important.
Yeah, yeah. So we kind of have a question here that's I'm curious on this one. So Stephanie said, what are your thoughts with employees that have low experience but demand a role or pay that doesn't compensate given their current skills or experience? So they're kind of wanting that next step. Do you have any thoughts there? Oh.
I think I might have lost you a minute there.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
You back?
Yes. Okay. So
Okay.
Steph asked the question, what are your thoughts with employees that have low experience but demand a role and pay that doesn't compensate their given skills or experience?
Oh, that never happens. I don't. So, yeah, absolutely. So great question. I think part of being an HR person, part of being a manager is having that aha moment, right? Having that tough conversation with folks, because people are coming into the workforce with and once on one side, it's good to have that confidence. But it can also be derailing if you can't back that up. And I think this is actually, I feel pretty strongly about this because we collectively have seen a lot where folks have been saying things like act as if, fake it till you make it, having that culture mindset which says, well, I should have all of this now. And I think it's a good HR person, a good manager who could say, okay, I can see the potential there, but I have to form a little bit of reality for you that you're not there yet. And here's why. Here's exactly why. Not, because I don't think you're a genius and all that, but if you're missing something tangible, it's that brave manager, that brave HR person who can communicate it, and you're doing them a favor. And the reason I say that is because people shouldn't be rushed out of newness, right? The newness that they have is incredibly valuable because you're going to see things differently than anybody else will. But the trick is you lose newness pretty fast. So don't be in the rush to get to the next step. You have to sort of earn it. And I'll go back to that boxing martial art example, all right? You could strap on a black belt all day long. It's a Halloween costume if you haven't earned it. And that's what you want to protect folks from is, let me give you a little reality here, folks. So I would say to the questioner, be brave, do the right thing, take care of your people, give them the, and then they may have the opportunity to not believe you and not take feedback. And that's the important part. I can give it, you could throw it away.
Yeah. Great question, Stephanie. And Tim, I think it goes back to creating that culture, right? Of you got to value the newness if you're going to communicate that, we're going to get you there and we're going to invest in you, and you got to back it up there. So we also have another question here on Angela here saying, Tim, can you speak to how training folds into career mapping? So just some thoughts on, first steps to once the job architecture is established and kind of getting training involved there.
Yeah, it's a really practical question around once you have your career map set up, you need to think about what gets me from one level to the other and what do I need. So I'll go back to the project management example you've been using. So I have a career ladder that says I want to go from being a project manager to a principal project manager that oversees other folks. Well, to make that jump, I might need to create a learning program for folks who may not have managed people before. They may have managed projects. They may have been responsible for resources within that project, but they may not have the nuts and bolts manager experience of doing the performance review and actually owning the comp and all that. So that may be something that's very specific to that role. Now, to make that practical for you as an organization, you may be putting other people into that same program who are on different career paths but need that same skill set. So you're always thinking about what are the collective skills that I need to have a bunch of folks going into it like for like, and then they can learn from each other, which is great. The other thing to think about is what can be done without having the leadership development program. And not to put anybody out of business, right? But the way I look at it is L&D is so precious that if you're going to spend class time with folks, especially if it's face-to-face, it should be absolutely in service of something. And if they can get it any other way, let them. And this way, you can really shine within the context of what you do in the best possible way for service for the company.
Yeah. Great question, Angela. And it actually, there's a question here on where do you start with developing these programs? So let's say they have the resources and they have kind of the buy-in from leadership on creating a learning and development program or creating additional opportunities. Is any, I know it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3, but any kind of steps to get the ball moving there?
No, you have to think about, I guess the first thing is whether you're going to buy or build. So if you have the expertise internally and you feel good about it, there's some certain things that you want. It also depends on what's going to be contained in that program. So if you're looking for, the generic skills of, like we talked about, coaching, feedback, communication, you may want to have that built and outsourced by people who do that all the time. If you're looking for how to manage budgets within the context of your organization, you may want to pull in leaders to help do that. And that actually creates buy-in for your programs. So when you're structuring your leadership development, management development programs, you may just want to look at the architecture and say, how much of this do we want to outsource, build internally, and then have taught either by internal experts, by HR, and by external facilitators. And if you have that architecture, number one, you'll get better buy-in, but you'll also save some money as you go.
Right. Yeah, super great question and awesome follow-up. So we have one more question from Kayla here, and it kind of perfectly follows up there. So she's asking, how can she convince her leadership that their current career development program, so they have a program in place, is not the end result of career development, but it's an ongoing, using it as a jumping off point. Any tips, tricks on communicating that to leadership?
Yeah, that is really it's so funny. That is a good question. I think a lot of organizations have that problem where I create a great program and then leaders think I put people in that program, tick, we're done, right? And we don't need to do anything else. So I think the way that you go back to them is say, okay, and you have to be careful about this because you did good work with the program, so you don't want to shoot in the foot, but say, have we achieved our goals by folks coming out of this program? So in other words, did I put them on this program because they were on a succession plan? And then did they actually take the role with that preparation in the succession plan? I put them on this program because they were going to do this project and they actually got the skills to do that. So that one word, because, will kind of give you your answer that, maybe it's effective, maybe we're getting people general skill sets, but where was the ROI in that? So you may be, okay, what do we need to do to follow up? And you may find out you're doing exactly everything right, and all you need to do is track the return of investment that you're already getting, and then say, okay, now we need to follow up coaching to kind of bring that learning back. Maybe it's as simple as having those folks be guest speakers at your next program.
There you go. Yeah. Great question, Kayla. And that's, I think, we had a Chris Corneen from MSI on an HR at the Table webinar. He goes, you got to speak leadership's language. You got to bring it back, dollars and cents. You probably have the data there. You just got to connect the two. So Tim, I know we're coming up on time, and I want to make sure everyone gets their Sherman HRCI credit if they want it. But before we kind of wrap things up, I want to ask any final advice or last thoughts that you want to leave our audience with.
So I would just say one really simple thing as you're thinking about development. Career development is a lot like physical development. So a company can give you a gym, right? Your manager can be the best trainer in the world. At the end of the day, you have to do the push-ups. There's no way of getting around that. And I think if we let employees know that they are ultimately accountable and in the driver's seat for doing it, they'll succeed with or without anything that we build. And that's empowering for them. And that's kind of what we ultimately want them to do, is be successful.
Yeah. Wow, I love that. Like, that's the perfect way to wrap this up. That was, just talk about employee buy-in right there, right? When you're saying you still got to do the work and you still have to be committed to it. But as a manager, I'm going to be right alongside with you like a trainer. I love that, Tim. So Tim, again, thank you so much for joining us today. For our audience, this is recorded, so don't worry. I see some chats. You'll get Tim's advice, and you can replay it over and over again, as many times as you'd like. We also have Tim's LinkedIn here on the slide, so feel free. He's been gracious enough to allow us to add that here, and I'm sure there's still lots of questions, Tim, so you might want to prepare your LinkedIn inbox there. Awesome. Well, thank you all. I'm going to pass it on to our voice in the wind to wrap us up.
Well, that about wraps it up for today's discussion. I want to thank everyone for your attendance today. Our guest, Tim Toterhi, CHRO at Science and Medicine Group and founder of Plotline, our host, Liv, and especially our sponsor, Clear Company, for making this episode of HR at the Table possible. We'd love to hear what you thought about our webinar today, so make sure to leave some feedback on our post-webinar survey. For our live attendees today, stick around just a little bit longer for our post-webinar survey to redeem 1 SHRM and/or HRCI credit. For any on-demand listeners, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. We'll be sending out this webinar on demand in case you want to use this for reference or send it to a colleague. Also, stay tuned for more HR at the Table webinars and for blogs deep diving into today's topic. Next month, we'll be hosting the Vice President and Director of Global Learning and Development at Golin in Recruit, Reskill, and Retain Today's Workforce. We hope you can make it, and we will see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks again, Tim.
Thanks so much.